Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. This is your guide to continuous brewing versus batch brewing. If you've poked around any kombucha home brewing sites recently, you might have heard about this process called continuous brewing, or CB. I do batch brewing, so all of the tips and tricks and processes that I talk about on my channel and on my website relate to batch brewing and not continuous brewing. So don't be confused because a lot of the processes are often very different between the two. Continuous brewing is similar to the first fermentation cycle in a batch brew in that you are using a vessel which houses your sweet tea and a SCOBY, and you're harvesting it regularly to flavor or to drink. The difference is that continuous brewing vessels are oftentimes much larger than your average 1 gallon standard batch brewing vessel. And continuous brewing vessels also have a spigot so that you can harvest your liquid right from that spigot. In continuous brewing, the SCOBY stays in that continuous brewing vessel, and you basically just let it grow and grow. Since the SCOBY is staying in that vessel for an extended period of time, some continuous brewers even leave it there up to 6 months without trimming it or without splitting it up or anything like that. Since the SCOBY is getting bigger and bigger and stronger, it actually takes less time for your kombucha to go through a first fermentation cycle. And since your kombucha is going to be going through that first fermentation cycle faster, that means that you're going to need to be harvesting your kombucha more frequently or continuously, hence the name, continuous brewing. When you're continuous brewing, you use that spigot to harvest an X amount of kombucha tea, which you then immediately replace with sweet tea. So every time you harvest kombucha from your continuous brewing vessel, you need to add more sweet tea to replace the amount that you've pulled away. I'm not a really big fan of continuous brewing, and the main reason why is because with a large continuous brewing vessel, the kombucha in that vessel will tend to sour a lot faster than if I was doing a batch brew. So even though I'm able to continuously harvest kombucha out of that batch, it just means that I'm doing more work over a spread out amount of time to make sure that I bottle that kombucha before it gets too sour in the vessel. I prefer batch brewing because it gives me a lot more control over when I bottle my kombucha and when I'm done with the first fermentation cycle. In a continuous brewing vessel, because the SCOBY is just getting larger and larger, and because the tea ferments a lot faster, it could potentially get too sour too fast. With continuous brewing, you have a harder time of making sure that there's an even distribution of yeast throughout your kombucha before you bottle. And it's because of the spigot. Because you're pulling from a spigot, that liquid is coming from the bottom of the container, which is where yeast tends to settle. So unless you're making sure that you're stirring your continuous brewing vessel before you pull any kombucha tea out of the spigot, you might risk having an uneven distribution of yeast or an overabundance of yeast in your kombucha. And also with continuous brewing, you run the risk of having an overabundance of yeast on your actual SCOBY. If you're not checking on your SCOBY regularly like you are in batch brewing where you have to remove the SCOBY and take it out and put into another container to start a next batch going, you might run the risk of having a SCOBY that's overloaded with yeast. So that's another risk you have to look out for if you're doing continuous brewing. And to me, it's just not worth it, and it's a lot easier to just do it on a batch by batch basis. So when might continuous brewing be a good option for you? So if you like the taste of first fermented kombucha tea, and if you're not really interested in flavoring it or building up that good carbonation in the bottle, then you can just harvest kombucha from the continuous brewing vessel pretty much whenever you want, and then just feed it a few times a week with some sweet tea to let that sweet tea turn into kombucha. That's a really great way to use a continuous brewing system if you're not interested in flavoring or bottling. But if you're like me and you really love to flavor and bottle, I like doing all of my flavoring and bottling all at once. So when my batch brews are done, I have a big bottling day where I juice all of the fruit that I want to use and I blend all the fruit purees that I want to use, and then I go ahead and bottle. But with continuous brewing, if your kombucha is getting too sour on an irregular basis, or if you find that you need to harvest your kombucha every couple of days or so, then it might be hard to do one big flavoring and bottling day. You might just have to have flavorings on hand throughout the week and do smaller batches of bottling from your continuous brewing system. Now that I have the hang of how long it typically takes my first fermentation vessels to be ready to bottle, I can schedule my bottling days. So there are a lot of pros and cons to batch brewing and continuous brewing, and depending on your lifestyle and depending on what you're looking for in kombucha, one method might be better for you than the other. It really is just up to your personal preference and your lifestyle. I happen to be a really big fan of batch brewing. It provides a really consistent, good kombucha, and it lets me bottle on my schedule. So just know that if you're out there looking for research, know the difference between continuous brewing instructions and batch brewing instructions, and make sure that depending on what you're looking for, you're following the right instructions for you. So thanks for watching. If you want more information, be sure to check out the other videos on my channel and go to youbrewkombucha.com. Happy brewing!